Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. And honestly, thank you. We're really blown away by the support.
Absolutely. All the new subscriptions, the likes, the comments, it's fantastic.
It really is. And the sharers, too. It means so much to us, and it keeps us going. So thank you, truly.
Okay, let's get into it. Because today, we're tackling something monumental. For those of you who've been following our Civilization Reset series, we've been kind of building up to this.
This is the big one.
This is it. This is what we've started calling our crown episode, our special episode in the Reset Timeline series.
And the title really says it all. Tartaria and the Mud Curtain Fourth Reset of Civilization.
Exactly. And just thinking about the scale of it.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We're diving into a topic that, if even some of the stuff holds water, it fundamentally reshapes our whole understanding of human history.
It really does. And you know us, we love to dig deep. But for this one, we went to a whole new level. Seriously.
Well, we've been living and breathing this for weeks. Weeks. Poring over literally hundreds of books across more than 30 libraries.
And the photos. Hundreds of photos of these strange, magnificent buildings.
And the maps. Maps that proponents say clearly depict a state called Tartaria.
Right.
And after all that digging, the conclusion we kept bumping into, the one proponents strongly argue for, is that someone damn cared about erasing every single mention of Tartaria.
It seems like it. In some areas, maybe they were really effective at scrubbing the record.
And in others, maybe less so. Or maybe not at all. Pieces remain.
So this deep dive, it's built on what we could find, wherever we could find any hint about Tartaria or, what some sources call Grand Tartaria.
Yeah, and if we're talking evidence, there's one piece that proponents point to as, incredibly strong, almost undeniable, they'd say.
Right. You're talking about the Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1771 edition.
Exactly, it's right there. Unequivocally states Tartaria existed.
Defines it and everything. A vast country in the northern parts of Asia. It even mentions borders, rulers, government administration.
Yeah, it's not just some vague label.
And look, if anyone listening doesn't quite believe us or just wants to see for themselves,
you can check it out if you're curious enough. And let's be honest, our listeners seem to be exactly the kind of people driven by that intense curiosity.
Definitely. Go look it up. It's pretty eye-opening when you see it there in black and white from that era.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. We were looking at these maps, right? Depicting Tartaria. And we stumbled on something ourselves. Maybe it's known, maybe one of you listening already knew this. If so, definitely let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear about it.
What did you find?
The Tartarian coat of arms, or their flag. It often shows this dragon, right? On a yellow background. Or maybe it's more like a griffin.
Okay, yeah, that's their symbol, according to the theory.
Right, but then look at St. George's coat of arms, the famous image of him slaying the dragon.
Wait, don't tell me.
It's the same dragon. Or griffin-like creature. It looks exactly the same as the one on the Tartarian flag or coat of arms.
Wow, okay, that is interesting. The imagery is identical.
Pretty much identical. Think about that. For proponents, this is huge. It's like one more piece suggesting someone was really determined to completely erase any memory of this, magnificent and creative civilization, the Tartarians.
So they repurpose the symbol, turn it into something being conquered.
Exactly. That's the interpretation. And you'll learn about this and many other really fascinating things about Tartaria, like the whole mud flood phenomenon, in this deep dive.
Yeah, the mud flood is a whole chapter in itself.
Oh, absolutely. And look, our ambition here, our hope is that this deep dive becomes our F-Lag episode. A signature piece for the show.
And with everyone's help listening, maybe we can make that happen.
We're going to lay out everything we've meticulously gathered about Tartaria, highlighting, like you said, that there are actually a great many sources of information, pieces of a puzzle that proponents use to build this picture.
Which brings us back to the core questions, really. What was Tartaria, according to this theory? If it was so grand, how could it just vanish from mainstream history?
Right. We need to explore that alleged vastness, the mind-boggling technology they supposedly had.
The Antiquitech.
Yes, and the cataclysms that might have brought it down.
And the deliberate actions, the alleged cover-up, designed to wipe it from our collective memory.
So get ready. We're going to be considering some really alternative perspectives on, pretty much everything you thought you knew about history. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The absolute fundamental question here. Was Tartaria a real place? Or is it just, a myth, a label for the unknown?
Well, that's the crux of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mainstream history, generally speaking, uses the term Tartary. quite broadly.
Like a placeholder.
Exactly. For Europeans, it was this vast, sort of poorly understood region in northern Asia. Think Turkic tribes, Mongolic peoples, nomadic groups. Basically a catch-all for the unknown East.
Right, just a big blank space on the map labeled, "Here be Tartars."
Kind of, yeah. But what's compelling for proponents of the Tartarian theory is their argument that it wasn't just a vague label.
They say it was more.
Much more. They argue it was a single, coherent, massive empire with actual defined borders, rulers, even a sophisticated government.
So not just scattered tribes, but a unified state.
Precisely. And that distinction is crucial. It elevates Tartaria from just a European naming convention to a potential historical superpower.
Whose existence, if true, would kind of throw a wrench in the official historical timeline we all learned in school.
A pretty big wrench, yeah. It suggests a level of organization and centralization that isn't supposed to be there according to conventional history.
And they claim the evidence isn't just like one obscure reference. They point to maps, right? Lots of maps.
Countless maps, according to the proponents. Official maps, too, dating from the 15th century right through into the 19th century.
So over hundreds of years, cartographers kept putting it on their maps.
Consistently, yes. And these aren't presented as, rare curiosities. They're shown as standard, authoritative maps of the known world at the time.
And the sheer size they depict.
It's enormous, spanning Eurasia, covering areas we now know as Russia, Mongolia, China.
But extending further, didn't you say?
Oh, yeah. Deep into Central Asia, Asia Minor, India, even parts of the Middle East like Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Israel, according to some interpretations of these maps.
Wow. That's vast.
And it gets even wilder. Some researchers interpret certain maps, especially from the early modern period, as showing Tartaria reaching across the ocean into the Americas.
And into the Americas, like North America.
Including parts of what's now Canada, yeah. Suggesting a truly global, interconnected civilization way back then.
Okay, give us some specifics. Which maps are they pointing to?
Well, a famous example is William Blow's 1627 map. Blow was a top Dutch cartographer.
Respected map maker.
Absolutely. And proponents say his map clearly shows this massive Tartarian civilization, with borders pushing right up against China and Mongolia.
And isn't there a modern twist to that map? Something about Putin?
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
That's part of the narrative, too. There are claims, often circulated in these circles, that President Putin made Tartaria maps public back in 2013.
Really? Publicly acknowledged them?
That's the claim. And then in 2017, he supposedly gifted a copy of that Blow map of Tartaria to the president of Tatarstan.
Which proponents would interpret as, what, a nod to the hidden history?
Exactly, a kind of high-level modern acknowledgement. Then you've got a 1652 map, which is fascinating.
How so?
It shows Tartaria right next to America. But America isn't empty. It shows these grand palaces and grand structures.
You're in America.
Places like Mexico, Havana, even Brazil, which, for proponents, strongly suggests a Tartarian presence, or at least a very advanced civilization already established in the Americas.
Before the accepted colonization timeline.
Way before. And this same map also shows Europa, Roman emperors, Asia, Africa, placing Tartaria firmly on the world stage.
And this wasn't just an early thing. These maps continued.
Oh yeah. Even as late as 1754, you still find maps clearly labeled Grand Tartaria, covering that huge swath of Russia and Asia. It shows a persistent presence in cartography for centuries.
So this raises a pretty important question then.
Go on.
Why do some of these maps, the ones proponents highlight, show such specific details? Like cities, roads, you even mentioned electric lines.
Yeah, that's one of the most provocative claims. In areas where mainstream history says there were only nomadic tribes, some maps appear to show infrastructure.
Which shouldn't be there, according to the standard narrative.
Right, so proponents don't see these as errors or artistic license. They see them as clues.
Clues to what? A lost technology.
Exactly, a lost, highly advanced civilization that had capabilities far beyond what we're told existed back then. It suggests organization, technology, not just scattered nomads.
But it's not just maps, is it? There are texts, too.
Correct. The narrative isn't solely based on cartography. There are historical texts and accounts, though their interpretation can vary.
Like?
Well, you have Procopius of Caesarea, an early Byzantine historian. He mentions an emperor of the Tartars way back in 635 AD.
635 AD. Wow.
Yeah, he talks about this emperor being defeated by a Persian ruler his son captured. And Procopius places these Tartars in Eastern Europe, Western Siberia, Central Asia.
Okay, that's early. Anyone else?
Fast forward to 1252. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine. He wrote a detailed account called The Story of the Mongols, whom we call the Tartars.
So he studied them.
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive. Talks about their kingdom, the landscape, the people, their culture, even warfare against them.
Does he describe them as advanced?
Well, this is where it gets nuanced. It's important to note, Carpine's early chapters actually describe pretty harsh conditions. Difficult climate, not exactly a high-tech society, and sometimes hostile people.
So his account doesn't perfectly fit the advanced empire theory?
Not entirely, no. It offers a contrasting perspective, which is crucial for balance. But then you have other more recent sources.
Like that book you mentioned.
Yes. James William Lee's The One World Tartarians, the greatest civilization ever to be erased from history. His whole premise is that Tartaria's history was deliberately censored and deleted. He argues for an active cover-up.
Okay, censored history. That leads to that CIA document, doesn't it?
It does. This is a piece of evidence that really fascinates proponents. If we connect this to the bigger picture of erasure.
What is it exactly?
It's a document declassified in 1998, but originating from 1957. And according to researchers looking into Tartaria, it contains language hinting at deliberate manipulation of historical records about them.
What does it supposedly say?
The phrasing, often quoted as something like, Tata history was to be rewritten, or even more pointedly, falsified, in order to eliminate references to the Great Russian aggressions and to hide facts of the real center of Tartar-Russian relations.
Wow. Falsified. That's strong language.
It is, and proponents present this as direct evidence of a high-level intentional cover-up. Not just history being forgotten, but actively rewritten for political reasons.
Okay, let's unpack this next part because it's truly mind-boggling. The scale of Tartarian architecture, as proponents describe it.
It's staggering, isn't it? They're not just talking about regular buildings. The phrase often used is veritable palaces by our standards today.
Palaces. Okay, what define them?
Think monumental qualities. Massive stone blocks, incredibly intricate details carved into them.
Things that look hard to do even now.
Exactly. And a surprisingly consistent architectural style that seems to pop up across different continents.
Which challenges the idea that these were all separate, isolated developments.
Right. It suggests a shared knowledge, a shared technology, maybe even a shared culture that defies what conventional history tells us about the technological limits of those periods.
And this leads to the idea of Antiquitech.
Right, precisely. What's fascinating here is the core claim. These grand structures weren't just built to look impressive or house rulers. They were functional. They were Antiquitech.
Antiquity plus technology.
You got it. A fusion.
Yeah.
And the central theory here is about energy, free energy.
Okay.
Proponents argue that buildings like cathedrals, mosques, capitol buildings, anything with large domes and spires were actually designed to harness etheric energy.
Etheric energy, like energy from the air.
Essentially, yes. A kind of natural ambient energy field all around us. These buildings supposedly collected it and converted it into usable electricity.
So the buildings themselves were power plants.
In a way, yeah. The theory goes into specifics about the mechanisms.
Like what?
Those spires, antennas, the metal crosses or crescents on top, even ornate metal railings. They weren't just decoration.
They were functional.
They were collectors, supposedly, drawing in this ambient energy. And they worked in sync with the Earth's own energy fields.
Like magnetic fields.
Geomagnetic frequencies, yeah. And also telluric electrical currents, natural electricity flowing underground.
Wow, so the whole building was part of this system.
The idea is that every property, big or small, functioned as an etheric generator station, all potentially interconnected in a kind of global grid.
Okay, that's a huge claim. What were the practical benefits?
Well, buildings could be powered, heated, and cooled very efficiently without burning wood or coal.
How did heating work then? What about fireplaces?
Fireplaces get reinterpreted too. Not for fires, but as electrical heating and cooling sources.
Like vents.
More like nodes connecting to those underground telluric currents. They function as etheric electrical vacuums, drawing heat in or pushing it out to regulate temperature.
And you mentioned bricks earlier.
Yeah, there's even a theory about the red bricks common in older buildings. That the red pigment, possibly iron oxide, allowed them to conduct and store electricity.
So the whole house could be like a battery.
That's the speculation, collecting and distributing power. It suggests a really deep integration of energy principles into the very materials and design.
So what does this all mean for someone like Nikola Tesla? His work on AC power, wireless electricity.
Right. Proponents argue Tesla wasn't necessarily inventing from scratch.
You mean he was rediscovering something?
Or influenced by it, yeah. or even directly repurposing leftover Tartarian occult technology, their term, meaning hidden or advanced knowledge like electrical capacitors that might have predated him.
Is there an example they point to?
The Buffalo Pan American Exposition in 1901 is often cited.
The one with the big electric tower.
That's the one. It showcased wireless electricity from Niagara Falls. Proponents see its design, its architectural details, as emulating Tartarian styles.
Implying Tesla was tapping into that older knowledge.
Or that the exposition itself was built on repurposed Tartarian tech, showcasing what was possible before it was suppressed. It suggests Tesla might have been revealing, not inventing.
Okay, so where can we supposedly see this kind of architecture today? You mentioned buildings we might walk past.
Exactly. Proponents say the evidence is in plain sight, if you know what to look for.
Like the U.S. Capitol building.
That's a prime example often used. Or the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Russia.
What's the specific claim about them?
That their lower levels were buried by the mud flood event we'll discuss later. And that photos exist showing them being dug out, revealing previously unknown floors, windows, doors, all sitting at or below the modern ground level.
Suggesting the ground level used to be much lower.
Precisely. As if the original first floor is now underground.
What about star forts? You mentioned those.
Star forts are fascinating. These incredibly distinctive star-shaped structures. You find them everywhere.
Everywhere, like globally.
Yes. US, France, Denmark, Italy, Malta, Slovakia. Hundreds of them. Often near water, often very old.
Oh, and the official story is they're military forts.
Mostly, yes. Designed for defense with overlapping fields of fire. But in the Tartarian theory, they get a different interpretation.
Which is?
Some suggest they were complex water supply systems. Others more radically propose they were energy production facilities.
Energy again?
Yeah. Their global uniformity, that consistent, complex design across different cultures and continents. Proponents argue it points to a shared advanced technology, maybe a single global civilization.
A Tartarian blueprint.
That's the idea. It's hard to explain their identical complexity otherwise, using just conventional history.
Okay, let's look at some specific buildings proponents highlight. What about Spain?
The National Palace in Barcelona, built relatively recently, 1926, 1929, for an exposition. But it's still standing, right? It's huge, ornate, looks permanent.
So the question is, how did they build that in just 3 years back then?
Exactly. With the technology of the 1920s. Especially when many other expo buildings were temporary. Its scale and permanence seem suspect to proponents.
What about older examples? Portugal?
The Palace of Nafra, built between 1717 and 1755. Okay, longer construction time, but look at it. The geometric precision is incredible. Some describe it as having a science fiction appearance.
Even for the 18th century.
The level of intricate detail, the sheer scale. It pushes the boundaries of what we think was possible then. It makes you wonder if they had techniques we don't fully appreciate.
And in India?
The Palace of Winds, Hawa Mahal, in Jaipur, built 1799. Proponents point to its advanced construction integrated domes, unique arches, those intricate-colored windows.
Suggesting lost knowledge.
Yeah, a level of craftsmanship and design complexity that seems hard to replicate today with the same efficiency or perhaps underlying principles.
What about closer to home, like U.S. state capitals?
Oh, definitely. Many are brought up. Illinois State Capitol in Springfield, for example, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Texas. They're often described as palaces.
Why palaces?
Because of their immense scale, the precision, the super ornate interiors, the grand domes. Look at the Illinois one, finished in 1888. The inside looks like a European palace.
And the question is, how were these built in the 1800s?
Right, with supposedly limited tech. And often, multiple massive public buildings, capitals, courthouses, churches seem to go up around the same time in the same regions.
Suggesting a level of resources and coordination that seems unusual for the period.
Exactly. Where did all the skilled labor, materials, and money suddenly come from for these wondrous administrative buildings?
Okay, moving further afield. Turkmenistan.
Abistan, or Abstain, often called a ghost city. Proponents focus on its structures described as insane, featuring prominent antennas.
Antennas for?
The theory connects them back to free energy, harnessing energy from the air, just like Tesla talked about. It's presented as a visual example of these alleged Tartarian energy systems.
And this idea extends to ruins worldwide.
Yes, absolutely. Ancient temples, buried cities. Think Temple of Inscriptions in Mexico, the Singer Mangaline Cave in Indonesia, Angkor Wat, lost cities in Peru. Turkey,
They're all reinterpreted as potentially Tartarian.
or remnants of that same global advanced civilization. Even natural-looking formations like the Chocolate Hills in the Philippines or pyramids found globally are sometimes folded into this narrative as potentially being artificial buried structures.
So the idea is a global catastrophe buried huge parts of this older world.
That's the connecting thread. Which leads to that important question. If these were just built for looks, or with the tech we're told about, why the consistent complexity? Why the similar features across the globe? Why the buried levels?
It suggests something else was going on.
For proponents, yes. It suggests a deeper, more advanced, and unified purpose behind their original construction, something that conventional history doesn't account for.
Okay, here's where it gets really dramatic. Central to the whole Tartarian theory is this idea of a massive cataclysm, the mud flood.
Right. And this isn't presented as just, a local flood here or there.
It's global.
A major worldwide mud flood event. And relatively recent, too, proponents usually place it in the early to mid-1800s.
That's a couple of hundred years ago.
That's the claim. And its impact was supposedly catastrophic,
How so?
burying the ground levels of buildings everywhere. We're talking 10, 20, even 40 feet of mud covering the original first floors.
40 feet. That's incredible.
It effectively caused a civilization reset. Wiped the slate clean, so to speak. An out with the old, in with the new scenario. Exactly, allowing the modern nations and the modern narrative to rise up on the ruins, often quite literally of the old world, with its history conveniently obscured by layers of mud.
What supposedly caused such a massive event? Just mud.
Well, the exact cause is debated among proponents. It's fascinating, actually.
What are the theories?
Some suggest massive water floods that carried immense amounts of silt. Others point to huge volcanic eruptions darkening the skies and causing atmospheric chaos, leading to mud rain or liquefaction.
Liquefaction, like earthquakes.
Possibly triggered by something else, maybe intense heat or vibrations literally liquefying the soil over vast areas.
Is there a specific timeline they propose for this?
Often, yes. Some suggest a first major mud flood event between, say, January 1740 and October 1741.
What triggered that one?
It's sometimes linked to a preceding Great Frost and a massive eruption of the Shivluch volcano in eastern Russia, causing huge atmospheric disturbances.
Okay, so that's the 1740s. Then what?
Those disturbances, or maybe other events, could have led to a second major mud flood around 1834. This one is often linked to the idea of a Great Reset occurring by February 1835.
A reset point.
Yeah. And then possibly a third mud flood event around 1892, which proponents claim largely destroyed the last remnants of Great Tartaria, leading to significant geographical change on Earth by 1894.
Wow, multiple events. Is there anything else? More out there theories.
There's a more speculative one connecting it to cosmic cycles, like a solar filament polarity reversal, a massive shift in the sun's magnetic field that supposedly happens every 460 years or so.
And that causes
Huge tsunamis, earthquakes, and widespread mud floods across the planet. It links earthly catastrophe to solar cycles.
Okay, so how does this challenge the mainstream explanation for buried buildings? What's the usual reason given?
Mainstream history and archaeology talk about the cultural layer,
Meaning?
just the natural buildup over centuries. Dust, debris, discarded materials, new construction on top of old. It gradually raises the ground level around settlements.
Makes sense. Things get buried over time.
Right. But proponents of the mud flood look at the scale and say, hold on, that gradual explanation, that cultural layer, it just doesn't seem feasible to them.
Why not?
Because it doesn't account for entire first floors,
Yeah.
sometimes multiple stories, being buried so uniformly, often 10 to 40 feet deep, across the entire globe, seemingly within a relatively short historical window.
Yeah.
Gradual buildup doesn't do that, they argue.
It seems too sudden, too widespread for just gradual accumulation.
Exactly. It challenges the conventional timelines and geological explanations.
So what's the physical evidence they point to? You mentioned buildings.
The proof, they say, is literally baked into the buildings all around us. We touched on it with the Capitol and Winter Palace.
The buried lower levels.
Yes. Numerous buildings worldwide found with lower floors, partially or completely underground. And there are photos cited, historical photos, showing excavation work revealing these lost levels.
And the windows and doors?
That's a key indicator. Windows that are clearly original, sometimes getting smaller as they go down, or even full-size doorways, just peeking out at the current ground level.
Not basements, but original ground floor windows.
That's the claim, suggesting they were once fully above ground. And the idea is, if you dig down far enough next to these buildings.
You'll find the original front door.
Maybe. Proponents point to anecdotes, like a shop renovation in Shelbyville, Indiana, where they allegedly dug down and found a whole buried storefront from a previous level.
What about stairs?
That's another clue.
Yep.
Buildings where you have to walk up a flight of stairs just to get to the main entrance.
Implying that entrance was originally the second floor.
Yes. Or stairs leading down from the sidewalk into what looks like a basement, but might have been the original ground floor entrance before the mud raised the street level. These are seen as post-mud adaptations.
Are there other architectural signs?
Proponents also point to buildings that look damaged, almost blasted or blown up before being covered by the mud, like some ruins in Rome. Or windows that have just been bricked up crudely.
Why brick them up?
Because they were now underground or partially buried, making them useless as windows. It's presented as evidence of adapting to the new, higher ground level.
And underground structures.
Tunnels? Yes. The existence of extensive underground tunnel systems and chambers in cities all over the world is often woven into this. Are they purpose-built tunnels, or are they the buried remnants of a previous civilization's infrastructure?
Or just buried streets and buildings.
Possibly, and then you get reports of sinkholes suddenly opening up and revealing buried buildings underneath. It fuels the narrative that there's a hidden layer just below us.
And you mentioned global examples earlier.
Right, it's not just one or two places. Proponents point to historical accounts from Seattle about literally raising the city streets and buildings after a fire and perhaps related ground level issues. Glasgow, particularly Bath Street, is called Mud Flood City by some researchers.
And ancient sites, too.
Yes, reinterpreting places like the Temple of Inscriptions in Mexico, Singer Mangaling Cave in Indonesia, even the Chocolate Hills in the Philippines, as fundamentally being ancient structures buried by this global event.
So the big question this raises is,
if these structures were just abandoned, why the incredible uniformity in how they're buried? Why the consistent signs of destruction followed by burial?
it doesn't look like simple decay.
No. To proponents, it strongly suggests a singular coordinated event or a series of related events on a global scale, something far more dramatic than just buildings falling into disuse over time.
So what does this all mean? If there was this massive mud flood, this reset, what happened next? The theory goes further, right? It wasn't just nature.
Exactly. The theory posits that the mud flood, whether natural or perhaps even induced, wasn't just a disaster. It was an opportunity.
An opportunity for whom?
For those who wanted to control the narrative, to eradicate certain knowledge, specifically advanced scientific knowledge, and establish a new version of history.
Who are the thing in this scenario?
Proponents usually point towards elites and their secret societies, a shadowy group driving this deliberate, systematic effort to control humanity.
By controlling history.
Yes. The idea is, as proponents put it, they shove lies down our throats from the day we're born. Why? To keep people from their history, because if you don't know your past, you are easily controlled.
It reminds me of that Napoleon quote.
History is a set of lies agreed upon. Proponents often use that, emphasizing the his story aspect, the story told by the victors, the controllers, not the true story, our story.
And a key part of this was suppressing technology, like the free energy stuff.
Absolutely. A major motive, according to the theory, was to eradicate advanced scientific knowledge, like the supposed Tartarian free energy systems, keep humanity dependent on controlled resources, keep them slaves to their companies and their families.
Okay, so if there's this deliberate erasure, how did they supposedly do it? What were the methods?
What's fascinating here is how something seemingly innocent gets implicated. The World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
World's fairs, like celebrations of progress.
Is how they were presented. But the core argument in the Tartarian theory is that those magnificent, often palace-like structures, they weren't actually built by the people of that time.
Wait, they didn't build them?
Not in the impossibly short time frames claimed, proponents argue. The theory is they were pre-existing Tartarian buildings.
Leftovers from before the mud flood.
Exactly. They were supposedly cleaned up, perhaps repaired, presented as brand new architectural marvels built for the fair, and then, crucially, most were torn down afterwards.
To hide the evidence, they were much older.
That's the idea. Look at the Chicago World's Fair, 1893, the White City.
Yeah.
Claims were made of 200 ornate buildings covering 630 acres, supposedly built in just 2 years by 10,000 men.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Proponents say it's basically impossible. Architects reportedly said just designing it would take 15 years, let alone building it with 1890s technology. Where was the heavy machinery? The armies of skilled artisans needed?
Good question. Any others?
Barcelona Universal Exposition, 1888. Claimed build time, 53 days, on 115 acres. Proponents deem that logistically not achievable unless the buildings were already there.
53 days, okay, that does sound fast.
Even the later National Palace in Barcelona for the 1929 Expo. Built in 3 years, yes, but its permanence and incredible detail still raise questions about it being just a temporary fair building. And the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, 1876.
What about that
The
one?
main building was huge, 21.5 acres. Proponents ask, why would supposedly profit-oriented business parents fund such colossal, expensive structures, operate them at a loss during the fair, and then just tear most of them down? It doesn't make business sense unless the goal wasn't profit, but erasure.
The demolition is key then.
Very key. It's seen as deliberate historical erasure. Most of these Grand Fair buildings were destroyed, often by convenient fires like parts of the Chicago Fairgrounds, or outright demolition.
Like St. Louis.
The St. Louis World's Fair buildings were famously detonated and demolished. Proponents see this not just as cleanup, but as a kind of ritual to symbolize the destruction of Great Tartaria, closing the book on that chapter.
And the fairs also served as propaganda.
That's the other angle. They weren't just destroying buildings, they were shaping minds, designed to condition and reprogram the minds of the Americans.
Oh.
By showcasing the wonders of the new industrial age factories, machinery, consumer goods, while subtly directing people away from the memory or possibility of things like free energy. Promoting factory labor over etheric power. It was about cultural replacement, pushing the Industrial Revolution's narrative.
So, World's Fairs as a tool of erasure. What else? Fires.
Yes, historical arson is another method proponents point to. Major city fires.
Like the Great Chicago Fire of 1871.
Exactly. That one, the San Francisco fire and earthquake of 1906, the bombing of Dresden and Tokyo and WWII, numerous mysterious fires that destroyed libraries and museums in the 19th and 20th centuries.
These weren't accidents.
Proponents view many of them as deliberate acts of historical arson, designed to burn away the evidence of the old world, its architecture, its records, its technology.
And the Chicago Fire specifically.
It's often seen as pivotal because it allowed the city to be completely rebuilt in alignment with how the elites wanted the cityscape, erasing the pre-existing, possibly Tartarian-influenced structures. A clean slate, architecturally and historically.
Okay, what about people? Did they try to erase memories too? You mentioned orphan trains.
Right. This is a really poignant part of the theory, and it connects to a documented historical fact.
The orphan trains were real.
Oh, yes. Between roughly 1850 and 1930, hundreds of thousands of children, labeled as orphans, were transported from crowded eastern cities across the U.S. and even globally, often given new names, and sent to live with families in rural areas, sometimes for labor.
So what's the Tartarian connection?
The theory integrates this by suggesting many of these children weren't orphans in the usual sense. They were survivors.
Survivors of the mud flood.
Or other related cataclysms that supposedly wiped out Tartarian society. They were gathered up and deliberately dispersed.
Why disperse them?
To repopulate empty cities. Cities that were formerly Tartarian hubs but were now decimated, and, crucially, to induce a collective memory loss.
How would that work?
These children, often traumatized and too young to remember clearly, wouldn't have memories of the before times. The new inhabitants wouldn't question the origins of the grand cities and buildings they were moving into. It severed the connection to the past.
And this ties into migration patterns.
Proponents also point to the large migration of Slavic Russians and Turkic peoples groups, potentially associated with Tartaria to the U.S. between 1820 and 1920, suggesting they were fleeing the upheavals and resets happening in their Eurasian homelands. Some sources even claimed groups of Turkic people were displayed like exhibits at the Universal Exhibition 1855 before being shipped off to the U.S.
Wow. And even cemeteries weren't safe.
That's another disturbing element. The large-scale emptying of cemeteries, most famously the Paris catacombs starting in 1786.
Moving millions of bones.
6 to 7 million skeletons moved over about 12 years. Officially, it was for public health overcrowded city graveyards.
But the theory suggests another motive.
Yes, it's linked to the last reset. The idea is that these bones were removed not just for sanitation, but to hide evidence of the previous population. Maybe victims of the cataclysm, maybe just too many bodies that didn't fit the new, reduced historical population figures, erasing the dead along with the living history.
It's a very thorough erasure, if true, even affecting time itself.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the alleged manipulation didn't stop at buildings or people. It extended to the calendar, to the very timeline of history.
This is the phantom time idea.
Or the related new chronology theory. It primarily points the finger at Joseph Justus Scaliger, a highly respected scholar in the 1500s.
What does he supposedly do?
Proponents claim he essentially created around 1,000 years of phantom history, basically the entire European medieval period, the Dark Ages, through his work on chronology and translating dates between calendars like the Julian and Gregorian.
He added 1,000 years that never happened.
That's the radical claim. That history jumped more directly from late antiquity, the fall of Rome, to the Renaissance, and the intervening millennium was largely fabricated or stretched out.
Was anyone suspicious at the time?
Interestingly, Sir Isaac Newton is often cited as a critic. His precise astronomical calculations for predicting eclipses reportedly didn't work with Scaliger's new elongated timeline.
The math didn't add up.
Apparently not. The celestial mechanics only worked with the older chronology.
And this idea got revived later.
Yes, in the 20th century by Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician and physicist. His new chronology used extensive statistical and astronomical analysis to argue the same thing, that historical timelines are flawed.
What was his evidence?
Things like eclipse records only aligning perfectly if you assume the official timeline is wrong, and if events like the fall of Rome and Constantinople are much closer together in time.
Okay, but why? Why allegedly insert 1,000 years of phantom time?
The why is crucial. It would allow the controllers of history to effectively erase entire civilizations that existed before the accepted timeline.
Like Tartaria in America.
Exactly. If advanced civilizations existed in places like the Americas long before Columbus, long before the supposed Dark Ages, that completely upends the official colonization narrative. Inserting phantom time pushes those earlier civilizations into a mythical past or erases them completely, protecting the established story.
Okay, let's unpack some of these other really unsettling connections that keep popping up when you research Tartaria. Star forts, for instance. We mentioned them briefly.
Right. You just can't avoid them. These incredibly distinctive, geometrically perfect star-shaped structures.
And they're genuinely global, you said.
All over the place. US, France, Denmark, Italy, Malta, Slovakia. Hundreds of them, many centuries old, often near water. Their design is remarkably consistent. Bastions, ravelins, complex defensive layouts.
And the standard explanation is military defense.
Yes, that's the conventional view. But the Tartarian theories, as we touched on, suggest other purposes.
Water systems or energy?
Exactly. Sophisticated water supply networks, or maybe even energy production facilities, tapping into those earth energies we discussed.
And the connection to Tartaria is?
Their global uniformity. How could so many different cultures, supposedly developing independently, all build these incredibly complex and similar structures? It suggests a shared knowledge, a common advanced technology, perhaps disseminated by a single unified civilization like Tartaria.
Okay, star forts. What about giants? That comes up too, right?
Oh, definitely. What's fascinating here is the connection proponents make to a race of beings believed to have founded Tartaria, the mighty giants.
Right, actual giants.
Known sometimes as the Tataski Velikani. Often associated in these theories with Aryans, but meaning an ancient advanced lineage, not modern racial ideas.
How tall are we talking?
Described as exceptionally tall people. Legends or theories suggest maybe 8 to 12 feet tall on average. True giants.
12 feet tall, wow.
And there's a linguistic link some make. Tartaria, sounding like the Greek Tartaros.
The underworld in mythology.
Right, where the Cyclopean giants were supposedly confined. Proponents theorize this myth might be an echo, encoding the historical trauma of the Tartarian giants' empire being destroyed, submerged in silt and soil by the mud flood.
Okay, giants. What else? Breatharians.
Yes, this is one of the more extraordinary claims,
Yeah.
that these giants were breatharians.
Meaning they didn't eat.
They supposedly drew energy directly from the ether, that ambient energy field, the Earth's grid, geomagnetic frequencies, instead of consuming physical food and water.
That's all out there. How does that connect?
This unique physiology, proponents argue, is linked to their supposed mastery over atmospheric vibrations and energy, which allowed them to design and operate their etheric generator stations, those energy-harnessing buildings.
And the architecture reflects this.
That's the argument. Back to those gigantic doors, windows, and ceilings found in many suspected Tartarian buildings.
They're seen as evidence they were built for giants.
Direct evidence, proponents claim. Why else build features on such a massive, disproportionate scale, if not for occupants, who were themselves much, much taller than average modern humans? The buildings fit the builders, essentially.
Okay, giants' energy. What about language? You mentioned Basque earlier.
Right, here's where it gets really interesting. Finding potential echoes in language.
Basque is unusual, isn't it?
Extremely. It's a linguistic orphan, completely unrelated to the surrounding Indo-European languages like Spanish or French. Its origins are ancient and unknown.
So the theory connects it to Tartaria.
It's speculated that Basque could be a surviving fragment of Tartarian speech, a tiny remnant of a much wider core language family that existed before the reset and the subsequent fragmentation of languages.
Is there any, physical evidence supporting that link?
Well, there's an intriguing carving proponents point to. On an old stone monument in a Basque town called Amior,
What does it show?
an 8-pointed star inside a crescent moon.
Okay.
So proponents point out that this symbol is almost exactly like the symbol on the modern flag of the Turkic Council.
Representing countries like Turkey, Kazakhstan.
Exactly. Peoples with Turkic linguistic and cultural heritage.
So what does this all mean?
Well, the Amior monument is much older than the modern Turkic Council flag. Mainstream historians would likely call it a coincidence. Stars and crescents are common motifs.
But Tartaria proponents see a deeper link.
Yes. For them, it raises a compelling question. Could there be an ancient, forgotten connection between the Basques in Western Europe and the Turkic peoples thousands of miles away in Central Asia? Possibly linked through a vast ancient empire like Tartaria that spanned that distance. It challenges the idea of completely separate histories.
Fascinating. Okay, one last connection. Coins. Did Tartaria have money?
This raises an important question, right? If it was a real empire, you'd expect currency.
Oh.
Well, there are these strange coins labeled as Tartarian that circulate online, often in collector circles or forums, discussing these theories.
What do they look like?
They often have really elaborate designs, sometimes showing architecture that looks like the Antiquitech buildings, mythical creatures like griffins, or even unknown alphabets.
Are they real? Authenticated?
That's the big debate. The mainstream view from numismatists, coin experts, is generally that they're misidentified coins from known cultures, modern fakes, fantasy tokens created recently, or outright hoaxes. No major museum officially recognizes Tartarian coinage.
So why are they important to the theory?
What's fascinating here is their symbolic appeal. Even if their authenticity is questionable by conventional standards, their existence, or the belief in their existence, is powerful.
How so?
Because if Tartaria did have its own currency, that implies a whole infrastructure, bureaucracy, organized governance, metallurgy, trade networks, all the signs of a sophisticated empire.
Not just nomads.
Exactly. So if we connect this to the bigger picture of erasure, some proponents suggest that any real Tartarian coins were deliberately erased or reattributed to other cultures after the reset.
Filling a gap in the story.
Precisely. The idea of Tartarian coins fills a gap in the mythos. It provides a tangible symbol of the complex, organized society that proponents believe was lost and suppressed. It makes the empire feel more real. So we've really covered a lot of ground here. We've journeyed through these old maps hinting at a vast vanished empire.
Examined incredible buildings that seem to defy their supposed origins and builders.
Explored the theory of a catastrophic global mud flood event.
And considered the possibility of a deliberate, systematic campaign to rewrite history itself. Erasing Tartaria.
It's a narrative that, it fundamentally challenges so much of what we think we know about our past. It forces you to reconsider the foundations.
Absolutely.
And this, naturally, raises a really important final question. What other magnificent truths, what other hidden histories might still be buried out there?
Yeah.
Waiting, perhaps, for our collective curiosity or willingness to question, to finally bring them into the light. What else is just beneath the surface?
It definitely makes you think. And, well, that brings us to the end of this truly special deep dive, our Crown episode.
It's been fascinating to explore.
If you're a new listener who just jumped in with this one, thank you so much for joining us on this, frankly, incredible journey.
Welcome aboard.
We really hope this exploration has sparked your imagination, maybe encouraged you to look at the world, history, even the buildings around you with fresh, curious eyes.
Please do subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button if you found this interesting.
And definitely leave us a comment. Let us know your thoughts, your theories, anything this sparked for you. We genuinely read them all.
And please share this material. Share it with people you know who are just as wonderful and curious about all sorts of topics as those amazing listeners who've been with our channel from the beginning.
Yes, please do. And remember, always, always remain curious. Always seek answers. Because, as we like to say, the truth is always out there.
You just have to know where to look.
Until next time, stay curious.